Stories are signposts for pivotal events in our lives, markers of who we were and where we've been. The right story coming into our lives at the right time can be utterly transformative. Like Stephen King, the master craftsman, wrote in On Writing, his memoir of the craft, writing is a form of time travel. And if that's true, then we, all of us readers, are time travelers. Welcome to another YouTube video. So this one, we're going to be talking about a top 10 list. So this is my attempt at trying to take a typical YouTube form and to do something a little bit more meaningful with it. So no point beating around the bush, let's get into it. I want to begin with Mao II by Don DeLillo. For me, this was a life-changing novel. It was a novel I discovered in my honours year at university, studying English literature, where I was fortunate enough to have a thesis supervisor who warned me off my initial idea, which was to write my thesis on Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, which would have been a disaster. And I wouldn't be the first victim of that sort of hubris, for sure. Instead, I chose Don DeLillo and focused on the role of the author in society. Mao II has a lot to say about that, in particular the writer's role, the role they ought to play, as well as the role they do play. The story revolves around Bill Gray, a reclusive Salinger-like figure, who embodies the archetypal 20th century novelist, but is acutely aware of the failing power of novels to capture attention in the information age. Here's something I wrote in my thesis way back when. Mao II's opening scene ends with the prophecy that the future belongs to crowds. What this future entails, it's up to the reader to interpret. At first glance, such a future appears hostile to writers, individuals working in competition with mass media spectacle and, in some sense, the revitalization of grand narratives. If the role of writers is to effect political change, we have to accept that it is becoming harder to do this now, if it was ever possible at all. My views on that question have changed over the years. Should writing be political? Nowadays, I think it can't help but be, whether it's backing in the status quo or undermining it. Either way, we make a choice. Written in 1991, it's hardly the first Don DeLillo novel to capture an emerging reality ahead of time. It sets up a revealing parallel between writers and terrorism, questioning the place writers occupy in the culture, and whether the ideal place for a writer is in fact at the margins, doing dangerous things. It makes you think, if serious novels were winning the war for our attention, would they be serving a worthwhile function? Or would that merely be an indication of their failure to challenge, to inspire action, to shape a culture, and make people think? The beauty of this novel for me is that after all these years, I can't stop thinking about the questions it raises. And I'm feeling it could be time for another reread, and soon, and possibly a video essay too. Some stories we encounter are echoes, shadows on the wall, we seek to replicate in our own lives. This is a case for me with The Princess Bride. You would have seen the film, which itself uses the framing narrative of an ill child and a doting grandfather. The novel, written by William Golding, perhaps best known for penning Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, stretches the metafiction so much further. Framing narratives within framing narratives set up hilarious punchlines, infinitely regressing. Superficially, this is just for the sake of a joke, but I think there's something else going on here with The Princess Bride, and at the heart of it, it's a love of storytelling. It has pride of place on this list because it's a book I picked to read at a difficult time of my life, perhaps the most difficult, as I was preparing to head into hospital as a 17-year-old for open heart surgery. Art imitates life, and sometimes we consciously choose for our lives to imitate fiction. That's the way I think about it now. I still remember waking up in ICU after a successful operation and my dad reading the first few chapters of The Princess Bride to me for the first time. It's corny as hell, just like the movie, a moment almost rehearsed, but somehow I didn't feel self-conscious about it. It actually felt right in a way. The way certain stories intertwine with our lives is a really fascinating thing, and sometimes what's ultimately an organic process begins with a tiny little bit of artifice. Dune is a little bit overdone on BookTube these days, particularly since the first two movies came out, generating a lot of debate. I'm placing it here not because it was a treasured teenage read of mine, but because it was a book I missed, narrowly. I've read it now and enjoyed it, but looking back, the time I should have read it was when I was 14. I had an English teacher who recognised my interest in books and science fiction in particular. He recommended I read Dune at a parent-teacher interview, but for whatever reason, I never picked it up. My parents never took the initiative either to get it for me at the time, and I just never read it till recently. What I've learned about Dune since is that it's a book that, if it hits you at the right time, as a teenager generally, it's life-changing. Now, sadly, I feel I'll never know. Would I have become someone different had I discovered Dune earlier? Or maybe there's still time. Perhaps I'll read it again a decade from now, and it'll hit me then with force. Or maybe it's not meant to be, for me, and that's okay too. Time to talk about the Harry Potter killers for pick 4. I suppose I have to admit I was one of the Harry Potter generation, coming of age in the 90s and early 2000s. But unlike a lot of people, I would never credit my reading and interest in reading because of Harry Potter. I read the first 4 and enjoyed them enough, but I also happened to read the works of Emily Rodder at the same time. Rowan of Rin, Deltora quests, both fantasy chapter book series by a homegrown Aussie author Down Under, who in my opinion blew J.K. Rowling and a Harry Potter series right out of the water. I spent the rest of my school years ardently anti-Harry Potter, and eventually times changed, public opinions caught up to me in some ways. The transphobic slurs and J.K. Rowling slowly becoming a cooker, or perhaps she always was. But let's forget about Harry Potter because my feelings haven't changed much about that book series in all these years. I want to talk about Emily Rodder's books because I still think they're brilliant. She captured what it felt like to be a young boy better than any male author did. The sense of adventure, the thrill of using nothing but your wits to overcome obstacles and dangers. Hell, they even made Deltora Quest into an anime, didn't they? Is it good though? Maybe one day I'll check that out too. Let's fast forward in time again, and my discovery of Haruki Murakami in my early years at university. This is a book, unlike Dune, that hit me at exactly the right time. It's embarrassing to admit it, but at the time I was exactly the sort of kid who fancied himself a Murakami-like protagonist. Quiet, reserved, shy, always thinking. I still appreciate Murakami to this day, even after seeing what's happened to his reputation and his inability to write women characters. But I think he's still a writer worth engaging with, and there's nothing like reading one of his books for the very first time. There's a kind of magic to the interiority of the narratives he crafts, even his works like Norwegian Wood, that are anchored in reality and don't rely on the same surrealist and magic realism tropes of his other novels. So let's move even further into the future, or more accurately into my recent past with Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed. You may have seen my first attempt at a video about Le Guin, focused on Earthsea. If not, check out the video here. That's one way Le Guin has changed my life. Her books prompted me to reach out to people, other readers, through this channel, and to share some of my own perspectives. And The Dispossessed is something completely different to Earthsea, but like so many of Le Guin's novels, they all do their own things. The protagonist Shevek isn't particularly compelling, but the circumstances of the world Le Guin establishes is masterful. There's nothing simplistic about the contrast she sets up between Eurus and Inaris. What appears at first a straightforward comparison between a liberal capitalist society and an anarcho-communist one is by the end of the novel so problematized that regardless of what your leanings were going into the novel politically, you'll have a totally different relationship to politics afterwards. Le Guin herself, we know, was a committed anarchist, but she doesn't write didactically, and she gives a fair view of multiple different perspectives. And like a lot of Le Guin novels, she doesn't give you the answer directly either. She points towards the answer, which was in you all along. So next I wanted to go to Yellowface, which is a book. I wanted to pick one novel that was BookTube famous, so here it is. It's not a great novel, but I also don't think it's trying to be high literature. The reason I picked it is because it's a novel I read with my partner, and it's one we shared together. It's something that isn't really life-changing, but for us, it was very generative. It started a lot of interesting conversations. It may not be a great story in itself, but it's a great book to talk about, whether that's with your partner, your friends, your book club, or even online like this. It cuts through to an interesting question about merit in the publishing industry. It's also an anxious novel, a deeply anxious novel, and one that revels in the insecurities of its protagonist in particular. But no character goes unscathed. Not even R.F. Kuang's apparent self-insert Athena Liu, who by the novel's end we know is hardly a positive role model. The real villain is probably the publishing industry itself. And the key takeaway is probably that publishing has always had issues, and will continue to. In a way, meritocracy was always a lie. The best books don't always see the light of day. The best books don't always sell. There are real complexities to authorial identity, and it's not an easy problem to untangle. I want to move on to another novel now, rewinding back to my early university days again. This might be the most personal book on the list, because it's one that I, ever since I first read it, associate with my aunt. My aunt who, perhaps more than anyone, modelled the value of reading and the reading life. When I read it, I've only read it one time, but that was when my aunt was still alive, and I haven't had the courage to read it again since. Now she's gone, but I still think about her when I think about this novel. Patrick White, if you haven't read anything by him, and many haven't, is arguably the greatest Australian writer. His stories are deeply concerned with the inner lives of his characters, and the aunt story is, in effect, a rectification of the neglect of aunt characters in literature. Often in stories, classic novels in particular, there's an aunt character who's little more than a prop. She might have a function of sorts, relegated to the background. She may provide some humour, as in Austen, or contribute an insightful line, but we rarely see the story from her perspective. The aunt story takes that character and reframes her, takes a middle-aged woman who's loved and lost, and builds out her life and experiences, makes her the central figure. It's revolutionary. When I think of my own aunt, she was a figure not dissimilar. A lot of my memories are of her sitting behind the galley kitchen counter, sometimes smoking, often reading, always observing. Alright, time to reset maybe. Let's talk about something a little bit lighter. Let's talk about expanded universes. Because we're all sick to death of Marvel, aren't we? And Star Wars. I know I am. The corporatization of media feels, at times, unstoppable. The sad thing is there's barely an attempt to hide it anymore. The glossy sheen isn't concealing the vacuous emptiness quite so well. But then I think back to my teenage years, and honestly, even more recently, during COVID lockdowns, for instance. For me, as something of a serious reader, there's nothing more comforting than expanded universe novels. I'm not ashamed to admit that. Everyone has their poison, here are mine. Until relatively recently, I had a good run playing Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar, the tabletop games. I played at various times growing up as well. But when I look back, all the effort I made, painting, playing, and it has to be said, spending way too much money, my favourite moments in the hobby were actually reading the novels. The Warhammer 40,000 Gaunt's Ghost novels are a case in point. Military sci-fi with dozens of compelling, fully realised characters. Abnett is as literary as you'll get from any Black Library writer, and he's a great writer to read. Alien novels and comics are another guilty pleasure for me. I think there's something about reading this kind of fiction where you know it's, well, a schlock, but you love the original content it spawns from so much so that it's like you're on a treasure hunt for those little gems, small gems, that make it all worthwhile. I think about the Alien novels by Mark Verheiden, both the novel versions and the classic comics which were based off the novels, which detail the aliens' arrival to Earth and the resulting infestation and the following Earth War. Not to mention the canonical early bombing of Australia in the Earth War, which is another little tidbit that for some reason makes me happy. It's genuinely horrifying though, having experienced the COVID-19 pandemic. We witnessed the rapid spread, the attempts at quarantine, the inevitability of global infestation as travel networks are shut down, and then the inevitable slide into totalitarian control. It's a little bit eerie, even talking about it now. But that's one of the reasons I love expanded universe fiction. So next I want to talk about Freud, Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, who's possibly one of the most misunderstood figures in the 20th century. And I want to talk about Civilisation and its discontents. There are so many sides to Freud in his work that it's an absolute shame when people reactively dismiss him out of hand. Freud was both a man of his time and light years ahead of everyone else. In many ways, we're still catching up to some of his insights. Then there's the literary Freud. Freud is a frustrated storyteller himself, self-critical to a fault, who writes such lucid prose, and yes, that's a dream pun. I always think back to an honour seminar class where we had a week on Freud, and one of the know-it-alls in class put up his hand and said, "Aren't all Freud's theories discredited?" As if he knew. That's about the level of engagement most people give Freud these days, and it's a shame. It's a real shame. Civilisation and its Discontents was a book Freud wrote near the end of his life. It's as relevant today as it ever was. Civilisation is something much more like literary philosophy, beautifully expressed. What freedoms do we give up in order to live within and contribute to a society? Why is repression a precondition for a functioning community? And is that necessarily a bad thing? These are just a couple of the key questions that Freud breaks apart and explores in Civilisation and its Discontents. It's speculative, wide-ranging, inconclusive, and it'll change the way you see the world if you give it a chance. I want to end on the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. But I actually don't have much to say except that it captures something about the cyclical nature of life as we experience it. This is another series that means a lot to me personally. A novel my older cousin introduced to me when I was around 15 or so. A perfect book at the right time in my life. I have to say it, often it's the manner in which we discover a book that imbues it with some level of its meaning and its relevance to our lives. For instance, I wonder if one day someone watches this video, or a video like it, thinks a book sounds worthwhile and discovers a new favourite. I wonder if that would be meaningful in the same way as if a close family member recommended you a book, perhaps when you were younger, and that book sticks with you for as long as you live. Or is that more or less meaningful than picking a book randomly off the library bookshelf just out of interest and discovering a whole new world? I think ultimately there are probably as many ways to discover books and stories as there are books and stories to discover. It's all part of the journey. What we choose to see, what we choose to avoid, to neglect, to close our eyes and push out of sight and out of mind. Now it's your turn. Tell me about the books that have meant something to you, really meant something. Let me know in the comments below. How do you find books to read? Who do you trust? And don't forget to like and subscribe as we continue to delve a little deeper. Until next time.